Hey, hello everyone. It's Dr. Caps coming back to you again. Dancing with the Darkness podcast YouTube channel. If you're a first time listener today, this podcast is a real, raw account of living with CPTSD, and it's not just a story about all of the bad things that have to do with CPTSD, but it's also meant to be a source of hope and redemption and positive for you. So if you're a first time listener, we're so happy to have you, and we hope that you enjoy this episode. And please check out our previous episodes. If you're an existing listener, I just want to thank you once again for your support. Anyone who hasn't subscribed or liked, please do that for us. It's a tremendous amount of support for us. It helps us tremendously. It's really the only way we're going to get this information disseminated out there to the public. And we are simply here to help people. It is part of my own healing journey to take my experiences and to use that to help others. So thank you so much. Today we're going to continue our series on attachment strategies, and what we're going to be talking about today has to do with the disorganized attachment style. Now, this is one that we don't talk a lot about, but believe it or not, it's actually one of the more common attachment strategies, and this is based on childhood abuse. It's based on developmental trauma, and it's quite a chemistry experiment. I'll just put it to you that way. So we're going to talk about today with this episode, how did we get there? How did we get to this disorganized attachment style? All of the things that were incorporated into that, so we can understand why we are where we are now, so that we can understand this is why we act this way in relationships. And so I just want you to sit back and enjoy. I'm going to go ahead and also throw in just a little bit of a trigger warning, because I am going to be talking about some abuse. It's not going to be graphic or specific, but it's going to be generalized, because I want to describe based on my own childhood, how I ended up having this disorganized attachment style. When we come back next time and finish talking about disorganized attachment, we're going to talk about what it's like to be an adult in this, and how do we break free from this? How do we start breaking out of this disorganized attachment? And there's some ingredients there. We have to, number one, we have to, in my opinion, it took a relationship with God and my faith to start breaking out of it. The second part, if you're not a person that is open to listening to faith or God, the second ingredient is that you've got to figure out how to be in a healthy relationship with yourself. And the third ingredient is that we start learning how to have a healthy relationship with others around us. Okay? And we're going to talk about that more next time. This episode, I want to talk about, how did we get here with this disorganized attachment strategy in our lives, and what does that look like? So I'm just going to say, this is one of the reasons I came up for the title for this podcast, Dancing with the Darkness, because one of the things I've noticed and realized over my lifetime with a disorganized attachment strategy is that there's this innate ability to find darkness wherever you go. It doesn't matter where I've been, what I've done, what relationship I've been in. I can find, it's like Eeyore from the Pooh, Christopher Robin stories on steroids. Okay, I can find darkness is everywhere. Okay, if it's not following me, then it's manifesting everywhere I've been. So basically, that term. Maybe you've heard before, the grass isn't greener always on the other side. Well, with a disorganized attachment, the grass is freaking dead. Okay, the grass is dead on both sides of the fence. It doesn't matter. Okay, so wherever I go, it's a desert. There's no grass, if that makes sense. There's this scripture in Revelation that is near and dear to my heart, and it's simply that Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Okay, he wants to come in and sup with you. He wants to be with you. So Jesus is literally saying, "I'm knocking at the door to your heart. Let me in. I want to be with you." Well, in my lifetime, before I was a man of faith, it seemed like the only thing that was at the door knocking was darkness. Okay, and as a child, a lot of times I had to let that darkness in, and I had to cohabitate with that darkness, and I had to live with that darkness and try to navigate that darkness. Okay, so this is from a developmental standpoint why this is so complex. This is one of the reasons why we call CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, because there is so many layers to this onion. It's very hard to just pinpoint each one. It's like a blooming onion at Outback restaurant, but it's dead. It's a dead blooming onion, if that makes sense. And so this encompasses us not only holding a tremendously negative view of ourselves, but we also hold a tremendously negative view of everyone else. Okay, so not only am I a piece of crap, but everybody else in the world is dangerous or evil or they're pieces of crap. Okay, so we just need to understand that this is what you're walking around with. This is the internalization that you develop into as a young adult and an adult. Okay, you're not deserving of love or capable of love, and others are not capable of giving you what you need, or if they're abusive to you, it's because you deserve it. Okay, so this is the element that kind of sneaks into the disorganized attachment that we haven't talked about with anxious and ambivalent, and even with the fearful avoidant. Sometimes I see people cross-pollinate these terms. They call a fearful avoidant a disorganized, and they're not the same thing. I disagree. I believe that Lewis Berger and some others that and Bowlby that developed attachment, they would say the same thing. These are different things, and the reason why is from a developmental standpoint. Okay. So what does it look like developmentally? This is where it gets really complicated and complex, because your caregivers are not only the source of relieving your fear and anxiety, they're also the cause of your fear and anxiety. Okay? So from a developmental standpoint, from a childhood brain, you do not know what you're going to get. In that famous movie, Forrest Gump said that life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Well, in a disorganized attachment strategy, a child that has been through this and developed into this, it's a box of chocolates, all right, but there's not going to be always chocolate in there. It could be a rat turd. It could be rat poison. It could be maybe a chocolate over here. You really don't know what the hell you're going to get, okay? You may get a nice little sweet piece of chocolate and get some nurturing and some comfort, and then you might immediately eat another thing and find out that it's rat poison and it's going to kill you. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a visualization of what this looks like. And so I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like from my own life. So as a small child, number one, in my circumstance, I went from one abusive parent to another abusive parent. It was never two parents. Okay, so not only did they have their own level of dysfunction, they also had their own style of abuse, to put it to you that way. Okay, so it's not like I was, I went through basic training with my mom and was ready to go, and then ended up with my dad, and it was like, oh yeah, been there, done that. It wasn't. It was two entirely different types of abuse. And so the growing up and the development and everything else, you can imagine how difficult that is for a child. Okay, and so we also have to look at the time frame, which we've gone from one extreme to the other. I put it to you that way. When I was growing up, 70s, 80s, no one really thought about childhood abuse. They weren't even talking about that. If you were getting beat, it's because your parents were good parents. If it was sexual abuse, everybody was like, nope, don't see it, don't know what you're talking about. It just wasn't one of those things that people talked about. Okay, and so there was no source of comfort, whether it be from mental health, from doctors, or even from the church. Okay, and so this is what I'm talking about. And being forced to coexist with this darkness, you really had no choice. Okay, and now unfortunately we've gone to the extreme where everything is abuse, but at the same time we're calling everything abuse. The system is still broken. because in my experience, trying to help children, they're overtaxed, they're overburdened, and they're not equipped. And so that's just the way that it is. So when you have genuine, real cases of abuse, it seems like you don't get anywhere. But at the same time, a kid can go into school and tell their school counselor, I'm being gaslighted, and then, you're the world's worst parent. So it's just a tremendous pile of crap, honestly. I'm just going to put it to you in the very basic fifth grade level terms. It's a pile of crap. And so how do we get here? How do we get to this disorganized attachment style? Okay, so your caregivers can be a source of comfort. They can be a source of causing discomfort, like we just said. So in my case, growing up with my mother up until the age of 8 years old, I never knew what I was going to get because it all depended on her alcohol consumption. Okay, she had the demon of alcohol. She had that addiction, and so there were times where most of the time I remember coming home from school, whether it was kindergarten, first grade, whatever it was. The memories before that are a little bit sketchy because we do a lot of what's called disassociation, which we've talked about before. It is a coping mechanism for children to survive. And so we find ourselves, I'm coming home and I've got this sense of anxiety already building, this underlying fear because I don't know what I'm going to get. And so sometimes I could come home and she wasn't drunk yet. She was already drinking every day when I came home. But I could get a little bit of nurturing and comfort from her. I would get the hug. She would run her fingers through my hair, tell me she loves me. I may or may not get something to eat. I don't know. That's a whole nother subject because it all depended on how drunk she was, how fast. So a lot of times I had to fend for myself finding something to eat. But I had that nurturing and that comfort that every child wants, and I had it for a very brief period of time. So I'm desperately starving and seeking this from my mom, but then it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we see Mr. Hyde come out once that alcohol kicked in, and then I really didn't know what was going to happen to me. It could be physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, it could be psychological abuse. She could chase me around the house with a knife. She could run after me with cigarettes trying to burn me. I mean, there was all kinds of really psychotic, bad things that she did. And really, my solace was that eventually she's going to pass out. So if I can just avoid her, run from her, stay out of her radar long enough, she's going to pass out. And then you get to this point as a small child where now I'm completely on my own, right? I have no supervision. I have no anything, right? So I can get into all kinds of trouble because basically I have no caretaker at this point because she's passed out. And it's sad because that was my only time of solace and not having fear was when she was passed out, okay? And that would change because she would bring intimate partners and other entities into the relationship that would abuse me as well. And so it got to the point where there was no safe place. Fast forward, I go to live with my father, and now we have tremendous amount, not so much, sometimes there was physical abuse, but there was a tremendous amount of verbal and emotional abuse. Very, very damaging. Basically, I thought my name was Idiot. Okay, forget my actual name. It's embarrassment in front of my peers. I mean, you name it. It was just a whole nother set of abuse. Okay, and so I want to talk about that's how we get to this disorganized attachment style. At the same point, what my father would do was sometimes he would lose his cool, and honestly, you find yourself craving this as a child because I knew that if he lost his cool and he beat the shit out of me and I could survive it, that he was going to have some guilt and remorse afterwards, and there was going to be a lot of nurturing and comfort. And so it's we can see why sometimes in domestic violence cases when people become adults and they end up in these abusive relationships, it's because they were kind of conditioned for this. And so they actually take the abuse and welcome the abuse, even because there's a time of peace and love and nurturing after that. And so, this is how we get into relationships with narcissists and the whole 9 yards, because this is how we've developed. This is what we think is normal. This is, what we're used to. And we start to believe that the only way we're going to get love, affection, nurturing, the actual relief from fear and anxiety, is that we have to go through an abusive episode. We have to literally be the brunt of their aggression, be the brunt of all of their frustration, whatever it is, and then we wait for the guilt and the shame to kick in, and the remorse, and from them to say, oh my gosh, what have I done? I'm so sorry. I'm never going to do it again. And there's a time of peace and love and nurturing afterwards. Okay, so if you've gotten yourself into one of those relationships, or you're presently in one of those relationships, I want you to understand that's how you got there, because we were conditioned in this environment with our parents. And so we end up getting into these relationships because it's what we think is normal. Okay. And so we need to understand that a lot of times as well, I mentioned disassociation as a child in these environments. We do dissociate a lot, which means that we have this ability, this amazing ability, as children, to literally put ourselves somewhere else mentally, whether it be a fantasy world or whatever. I know that one of the things that I did, I had, when I went to live with my father, I had a tremendous amount of night terrors and fear and stuff at night. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that I had always had animals around me when I was young. And I would literally sleep in the kitchen on the floor with the dogs, and I felt safe with the dogs. And so when I went to live with my father, I was alone. I didn't have a pet for a long time. And so I think that was part of it. Part of it was I was starting to really try to process the trauma my mother had put me through. And now I'm into this whole brand new environment. I basically don't even know my father, and I have to reacclimate and learn this whole new set of rules and very, very strict, very regimental, very, very critical. No matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. So I've got a whole nother set of circumstances I have to navigate. But, I want to give you an example of dissociation is, I had this imaginary thing that I would do every night. I grew up Catholic, and so we talked about guardian angels and how there would be, 2 at the head of your bed and 1 at the foot of your bed. And that was a source of comfort for me, that I believed that I had these guardian angels, but also I had these stuffed animals in my room, and I literally had manifested in my mind at night that these spirits would come out of my animals, and that all of this was surrounding me and protecting me. And I had to go through this ritual every single night, or I wouldn't get to sleep because I was terrified. And so I would say my prayers, and then I had this whole ritual in my mind where the angels came out, and then the spirits from my stuffed animals would come out. I had this white polar bear, and then I had this wolf that would come over here, and these were all of my protectors, my imaginary protectors. And so I'm not just protecting myself from perceived darkness or perceived things. I'm also protecting myself from what's right in front of me. Is my dad going to come and yell at me more? Is he going to let me sleep? I don't know. So this was one of those dissociation things that I did as a child to survive. And I did that for a long time. I mean, I did that up until my early teens. That's we can be very, very mature. We can be very old. We can have old souls based on what we've been through, but yet we still have this inner child part of us that is manifesting comfort in any way that we can get it. And so that's one of the things I did to dissociate to get through this. So what kind of abuse are we talking about that gets you to a disorganized attachment? Okay, we're talking about poly abuse most of the time. It's not just going to be physical. It's not just going to be verbal. It's not just going to be sexual or psychological. And so I believe at this point in my life that God has given me the strength to share my story and to throw these things out there, because I can equally be empathizing with any individual that's a victim of abuse. I can talk to people that have been sexually abused. I can talk to people that have been verbally, psychologically, or physically abused because I went through all of them. And I went through all of them for years. Even into adulthood, I continued to go through abuse because we end up in abusive relationships. It's just what it is. Whether it be romantic relationships, friendships, even at work, toxic bosses, it doesn't matter. We have this mentality that we are worth nothing. Everybody else is a piece of crap, so it doesn't matter. And if we're getting abused, it's because we deserve it. It's just the way that it is. This is reality. Okay. And so psychological abuse, what does that look like? Some of the psychological abuse that I dealt with, a lot of was, I'll give you an example. My mother made me watch the movie The Exorcist very early in life. I probably was 4 or 5 years old. And so the movie is already extremely traumatic because I'm terrified that there's demons and devils all around trying to hurt me. But then she would take it further when she would get to drinking, and she would roll her eyes back in her head to where there was the white of her eyes, and she would act like she was possessed. So quite terrifying, right? This is the source of my comfort when she's sober, the nurturing. She was a nurse, so she could be caring and nurturing and fix my boo-boos. But now, for all I know, she's possessed by a demon, and what is she going to do to me? Some other forms of psychological abuse, she would sit there and have a bottle of Tylenol and tell me I'm going to take all of these Tylenol and I'm going to die. Okay, so I constantly had this fear, this psychological fear of being alone, because not only am I in this abusive household, but, the world is bad, right? The world is even more scary than my mother. So what am I going to do when I'm all alone? I don't have anything but her, right? And, this helps you understand how we end up in these relationships later too, because when we end up in these abusive relationships or with narcissists, you understand that they do the same thing. You're isolated, and you get to a point where you feel like they're the only thing that you have. Okay, so this is all part of the design with that psychological abuse. Obviously, we have emotional neglect, which we've talked about, which means my feelings don't matter. I don't even know how to really express my feelings because I have no model to follow, so I have no emotional regulation. I don't know what angry looks like, sad looks like, I don't know. I just experience it, and most of the time you're ridiculed for it, right? If you get mad, you're ridiculed. If you get sad, you're ridiculed. If you cry, you're a sissy. So we just don't know what to do. We have no emotional regulation because we're being emotionally neglected. Now, once again, we get into these adult relationships, and it looks like that too. We end up, this is very common with men who have been abused, especially. We end up with covert narcissistic spouses. And one of the key things there is that our feelings don't matter as a man. Basically, you're a man, you do this, but part of being a man is your feelings don't matter, your emotions, whatever. You're not here for that. You're here to do the man stuff, whether it's physical labor or go out and support us and pay the bills, whatever. Okay, so we end up in that situation, and this is why we end up there. Okay, physical abuse, of course, especially when you don't know when it's coming. There's the difference between, hey, I got an F in school, or I stole, or I did something bad, and I'm going to get a whipping for it. There's a certain level of preparation that you know that you're going to get that, but then there's the physical violence that's completely unhinged and you just don't know. And I grew up in that environment. I remember one time going up to my mother as a small child, maybe 4 or 5, and I was going to hug her and get some comfort, and instead I caught a phone receiver across the head and was knocked out. And that was my first traumatic brain injury. I would find out late in life, when you go through these military related injuries, and they did imaging, they were like, hey, you've got a really old TBI. And then we kind of equated it to that time as a child when I was knocked out by that phone. But this is what I'm talking about with this physical violence, is you don't know when it's coming. So I may get a hug, I may get the crap slapped out of me, I don't know. Okay, so it's very unpredictable. Okay, so that's scary. Of course, we have the sexual abuse, we have incest. We're not really going to go into that too deeply, but A lot of times the sexual abuse is, once again, that's when I talk about cohabitating with the darkness and letting the darkness in and dwelling with the darkness. That's what I'm talking about, because this sexual abuse is connotated with them giving you love and nurturing and comfort, if that makes sense. So they're being very kind to you in order to get what they want sexually, okay? And so it's a dangerous dance. It warps our sexuality and it carries on with us through life, which we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about what hypersexuality looks like and different things based on that abuse, but we're not going to talk about that today. But that's one of the things. Exposure to marital conflict is a big one. Okay, I remember, I think my parents were already divorced. They divorced, shortly after my birth, but they still would fight a lot. When my dad would come over there, whether it was his weekend to have me or whatever, there was still a tremendous amount of marital conflict. And I remember my mother, we talked about the way we develop into abusive relationships. Well, that was a postcard of my parents, because they obviously were in those childhoods as well, because my mother would push and push and push and push until she would make my dad lose his cool, and then something bad would happen, and then, oh, we love each other again, okay, and then they're up there having sex. So I mean, it's absolutely crazy, but that's the kind of thing that I was used to seeing, and that was what I developed into, and that's been a lot of my relationships too. Let's see, addictive behavior. Obviously, we talked about the alcohol. That can be drugs, alcohol, sex. It can be any kind of addiction that you are privy to or you experience. All of these abuses contribute, and when we have poly abuse or several instances of abuse over a long period of time with CPTSD, we do develop this disorganized attachment. And so, next video, we're going to talk about what that looks like as an adult. We've kind of touched on that subject, but I want you to really understand why you are who you are as an adult, why you're in the relationships that you're in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about hope, and we're going to talk about ways to counteract these attachment strategies and how to be healthier and happier. So I hope today we gave you kind of a shotgun blast, really, of what that disorganized attachment looks like. How did we get there? Why did we get there? And it does involve a lot of painful experiences. It's a developmental process. It's a chaotic process. It's a very, very hard process to go through. But I want to leave this video not just picking a scab and making you upset or making you sad. I want you to know that this is just educational. This is just you understanding. I have to revisit a little bit. I have to look at my childhood a little bit in order to understand how I'm going to stop being that way with my attachment strategy. How am I going to be healthy with my attachment strategy? So we look at these things from childhood not to make you feel shame and guilt, because the number one thing I want you to understand is that none of this was your fault. It is a product of generations of abuse. It is a product of generations of sin. And you did come into this world innocent. You did come into this world unblemished. God created you and crafted you for a reason. And nothing that happened to you was deserved. And nothing that happened to you is okay. And I want you to understand that God loves you and that there's other people out there that have also experienced this. And I'm one of those examples to show you that you can get past this. You can live a good life. You can learn how to love. And you can learn how to be loved. And you can actually turn this pain into purpose, like we're trying to do here with this podcast, and help other people. So I want to leave you on that positive note. I want you to know that you are never alone. There is a loving Heavenly Father in heaven that loves you. And we're going to talk about that in our next video. One of the things that we have to really embrace if we're going to get out of this anxious, ambivalent, or disorganized attachment strategy is we need to see consistency in a healthy way. And in my experience, the number one thing that is consistent is God's love. He never leaves you, he never forsakes you, and he never harms you. He's only there to love you. And so once we understand that we were crafted that way by a loving God, we understand that we can love that way, and we can also be loved that way by others. Dr. Capps here. signing out with this episode of Dancing with the Darkness. God bless each and every one of you. If this video spoke to you, please comment, please like, share, subscribe. We're here to help, and we're praying for every one of you. God bless. We'll see you next time.